On the phone with me right now is my guest, Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo. Dr. DiLorenzo is an economics professor at Loyola University in Maryland. He is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and the author of several books, including the most recently released Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government. Dr. DiLorenzo is also a frequent contributor to LouRockwell.com. Dr. DiLorenzo, thank you for joining the Chris Bronson Show.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
You know, I've been reading your articles for many years, been following you on the internet and a lot of your lectures. I read Lincoln Unmasked recently, especially with all of the hero worship that I see going on of Lincoln lately. I guess the first question is, what was your opinion on the most recently released Spielberg movie?
Well, it's a lot of great acting because Daniel Day-Lewis is a star and Sally Fields is in it, and they're both, among the best actors in the world, in my opinion. But the movie is based on a complete fiction. And the fiction is that Abe Lincoln used his political skills to get the 13th Amendment through the House of Representatives, so that the 13th Amendment ended slavery legally in the United States. But in an article I wrote on LouRockwell.com a week or so ago on the subject, I quoted the preeminent Lincoln authority in the United States, or in the world for that matter, David Donald from Harvard University, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Lincoln biographer. And he discusses this issue in his book, and he points out that Lincoln actually did nothing. He did not, there's no evidence, he said, those are his words, no evidence that anything Lincoln did changed even one vote in favor of the 13th Amendment. And in fact, David Donald writes about how the real abolitionists in Congress, people like Thaddeus Stevens, asked him to help them get the 13th Amendment passed. And, for example, they told him that there were some New Jersey Democrats who they thought could be persuaded to vote yes after they had already voted no previously. This was the second vote. If Lincoln could do something to get Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts to withdraw a bill that he had proposed to regulate the railroads in the state of New Jersey. And Lincoln's response was, no, I'm not going to do it. And so he had a chance to actually change some votes in favor of the 13th Amendment, and he flatly said, no thanks, I'm not going to participate. And so and the whole theme of the Spielberg movie is exactly the opposite. And so the theme of the Spielberg movie is just precisely upside-down history. It's the opposite of what actually happened.
So it's pushing this idea that we've been kind of inculcated into, at least in the government school system in the past 100 years, of Lincoln as sort of this benevolent guy who, he loved all the downtrodden, all the people that were enslaved, but the reality is quite different. We seem to, at least when these historians release these books, where they rate presidents, they always put Lincoln 1, 2, or 3. Lincoln wasn't really that well liked, even in the North when he was president, was he?
No, that's another myth of the movie. One of the lines in the movie is Mary Todd Lincoln, played by Sally Fields, says at one point, "You are the most loved person in history," something along those lines. That's not an exact quote, but that's a paraphrase. But there was a historian named Larry Tagg, his last name is spelled T-A-G-G, who wrote a book called The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln about 2 years ago, and the subtitle of the book is America's Most Reviled President. And he documents with tremendous detail the fact that in his own lifetime, Lincoln probably was the most hated and reviled of all American presidents. And I'm talking about by Northerners. Of course, everyone assumes Southerners hated him, but Northerners and Europeans. And he was widely seen as a scoundrel because, after all, he illegally suspended habeas corpus and mass arrested tens of thousands of Northern citizens without due process for merely questioning his policies. They even put into prison newspaper editors. He shut down over 300 opposition newspapers in the northern states. And so naturally he would be hated by any freedom-loving people, which most of the people in the northern states, of course, were in the 1860s. And so that's another big lie that's told in the movie in a single sentence by Mary Todd Lincoln, portrayed by Sally Fields.
I thought it was interesting in a lecture that I saw that you gave for the Mises Institute lately, that the only place there was any free speech during the Civil War was in places like Fort McHenry and all these different places that Lincoln threw at least the people he saw as oppositionists, but he seemed to throw tens of thousands of people in these places. I mean, was the guy just basically paranoid?
Yes, he was a dictator, but the people like Steven Spielberg and Doris Kearns Goodwin, whose book the movie is supposedly based on, say he was a nice dictator or a friendly dictator. And that statement of mine that you're referring to was I was quoting a book by a historian named Dean Sprague, and the book is called Freedom Under Lincoln, where he documented how tens of thousands of northern civilians were imprisoned without being arrested, without any due process, without their day in court, for merely speaking up against such things as the illegal suspension of habeas corpus. And Dean Sprague is the one who wrote in his book that in the northern states during the Civil War, the only place where there really was genuine free speech was in these prisons, in these gulags. One of them, the most notorious, was probably Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. And because, after all, once you're already in prison for speaking your mind about politics, what have you got to lose? What are they going to do, put you in prison? And so when I wrote that in an article, I had a bunch of emails from older people from Eastern and Central Europe telling me, well, this is how it was in communism. The only place you could really speak freely about the government was in prison.
When we look at the recent dialogue that's kind of peripherally related here, and referring to one of the other recent articles you wrote, I guess now former Congressman Ron Paul was recently ridiculed by some people who I see, in my opinion, as lesser minds, people like you point out, and others, when he said that secession is a deeply American principle. Now, when we look at American history, what do you think he meant by this, and was he correct when he said this?
Well, he meant what he said, and he certainly was correct. And in an article on LouRockwell.com, I refer to Bob Schlesinger, the son of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who's an editor at U.S. News magazine, as sort of ridiculing Ron Paul for saying that. But, the reason he said that is he's reminding people, keep in mind, America was created by a war of secession from the British Empire. The Declaration of Independence was a Declaration of Independence. What does that mean? It means the American colonists seceded or separated from the British Empire. So the whole idea of America is based on secession and freedom of association and voluntary union. And then, of course, when Tom, and Ron Paul also knows that after Thomas Jefferson was elected president in the year 1800, the first secession movement after the American Revolution was the New England Federalists. The New England politicians plotted for 14 years to secede. They actually held a secession convention in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814. And, of course, that's how the Constitution was ratified, by political conventions at the state level. And so to de-ratify or to secede, the New Englanders thought, that the proper procedure is to hold a convention, and we will vote up or down whether to stay in the Union. And they hated Jefferson so much and Madison for that matter, because of the War of 1812, which they did not participate in. They hated the Louisiana Purchase, and they wanted a much bigger government than Jefferson did, and they didn't think New England fit in the American Union. So they actually did hold a secession convention, and they ultimately voted to stay in the Union, but hardly anybody questioned the rights of to secede, because, after all, as they said, that was the whole principle of the American Revolution. And that movement was led by a man named Senator Timothy Pickering. He was a United States Senator from Massachusetts. He was also George Washington's Secretary of State and Secretary of War. So this wasn't a gang of crazy tax evaders or something like that. These were some of the most prominent members of the founding generation, and they naturally understood what Ron Paul said, is that secession is a very old American tradition. It's freedom of association, after all.
When we look back at the Civil War, when you look at the editorials and just the general sentiment, even in the North, before the incident at Fort Sumter, before Lincoln, in my opinion, engineered the opening shots of that war, was there really... Is it true that there was a lot of these newspapers and people in the North saying that the South did in fact have a right to secede from the Union, and that it was Lincoln who was really in the minority?
Well, yes, that's true. He was elected with 39% of the vote in 1860, so he really was a minority president. There were 4 candidates, presidential candidates in that year. And there's a big 2-volume set of books called Northern Editorials on Secession by Howard Cecil Perkins, and that I own. And it's a collection of newspaper articles from northern newspapers in 1859 to 1861, and the overwhelming majority of them essentially quoted Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence by saying governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever the governed no longer consent, then it is their duty, not just their right, but their duty to abolish the government and replace it with a new one. And so newspaper after newspaper in the northern states in 1860 and early 1861 repeated some version of this statement from the Declaration of Independence to say that the Union is a voluntary union. That means we, the people, have a right to vote whether we want to be in or out of the Union. And they also made a big point of the fact that if the Union were ever to be held together at gunpoint or at force, it would just make a mockery of the whole idea of the American Union. I mean, that's how the Soviet Union was kept together, by force and bloodshed and mass murder, not the American Union, they said. Well, they were wrong. Lincoln was willing to do that. And, of course, I pointed out in many of my writings that the invasion of the southern states was the very definition of treason under the U.S. Constitution. Article 3, Section 3 defines treason as only, it uses the word only, levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to their enemies. And so it uses the plural of United States, their enemies. It uses the word them, too. And so what it means is that the free and independent and sovereign states are to be protected by this Constitution, and levying a war against them would be the ultimate sin. It would be treason. And that, of course, is exactly what Lincoln and the U.S. Congress did in 1861 to 1865.
Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, Senior Fellow at the Mises Institute, is my guest. Dr. DiLorenzo, when we look at our so-called beloved 16th president, a lot of people don't know that he shut down, opposition newspapers, that he intimidated judges, that he even deported a congressman that disagreed with him, and that he really, set the ball moving forward on the forced conscription of soldiers. Why is it, do you think, that so many people on the right and the so-called right and the left really adore this man?
Well, they're basically totalitarians. They basically want to use totalitarian methods of government to achieve their ends. On the right, we usually, nowadays, we think of the neocons who want America to be the policeman of the world and to invade pretty much every other country, with a possible exception of Canada, I think, the way they sometimes act. And of course, the left, they want worldwide socialism, beginning with America, and it takes a big, powerful dictatorial government to achieve either of those things. And so I think when you pull the masks off all these people, they really are totalitarians. That's why they get into politics in the first place, to have this compulsion to push other people around and order other people around. And it's very easy for them to become drunk with power, as the old saying goes. And no one is a bigger role model than Abe Lincoln. He waged an illegal war. He committed treason by waging the war. He suspended habeas corpus. He imprisoned dissenters. He deported an opposition member of Congress. They confiscated firearms by destroying the Second Amendment. He even issued an arrest warrant for the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, when Taney issued an opinion that his suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional. And so all of this is cheered by the left and the right, who want dictatorial executive power to achieve whatever ends they want to achieve.
I was looking at a quote you recently had in your most recent LouRockwell.com article where you said that the U.S. has become a giant plunder-seeking society where the net tax consumers now outnumber the net taxpayers. When we look forward here in the United States of America, do you think that there could be, given the right catalyst, we could see a massive sort of secession movement reemerge here in the U.S.?
Well, you probably have read recently that all people in all 50 states have sent petitions to the White House
right.
About secession. And so a lot of people are waking up to the idea that this was the original American system. That's why Ron Paul mentioned it. And that's why the media elite immediately started denouncing him for suggesting that the American government could in some way be voluntary. What could be a bigger sin than to suggest that government's just powers come from the consent of the governed? I mean, we can't let the governed have consent, can we?
Yeah.
They might not agree with what the Washington establishment wants to do, whether it's being a policeman of the world and dropping bombs on Libya or Syria or Iran or wherever, or creating an even bigger welfare state. And so the Soviet Union imploded by numerous acts of peaceful secession, and I think that's what eventually will have to happen in the United States, because we're just on the road to destroying the capital stock of the country, destroying the wealth, destroying the entrepreneurial impulse, and turning it into a socialist hellhole, and with regulation run amok and welfare statism run amok, and not to mention militarism. And so at some point, somebody's going to get fed up with this. There's probably the strongest secession movement is in Vermont. There's a group called Second Vermont Republic. For the past 10 or 12 years, that have been very serious about creating an independent republic in the state of Vermont. And I think they're going to have some success in persuading people in other parts of the country that this is the way to go. You can tell the Obamas of the world, you can keep your socialist paradise on the Potomac, but leave us out of it.
Yeah, unfortunately, it relies on the plunder of everybody elsewhere. I think they said recently that the top 10 most wealthy counties in America, I guess 8 are in the Washington D.C. metro area.
Naturally, and they look at the top 2% of income producers, the most productive people in the country, who pay something like 60% of all income tax, and people who pay no income tax claim that the top 2% are not paying their fair share. That's where we are today. People who pay no tax are saying people who pay 60% of all the tax are not paying their fair share. And politicians love to play that game, of course, because there's more votes in the lower non-tax-paying class than there are the top 2%.
So we're living in a kind of through-the-looking-glass society where it's patriotic to pay taxes. In a country that was founded on the basis of a tax revolt, now all of a sudden to pay taxes means you're a patriot, and secession is not an American thing. They had the petition a few weeks ago. I don't know if you saw it. The people wanted to see the petition signers for secession deported or thrown in prison or something like that. I mean, we live in a very strange, un-American sort of time. I mean, it almost seems like the country doesn't really resemble anything like, well, I guess what it was supposed to be.
Yeah, well, I think people have to realize that all these pretty boys on television and all the beauty queens that they put as the face of television, that the real network executives are hardcore Marxist ideologues. If you listen to what goes on MSNBC and CNN, the message they get about politics is really a hardcore left-wing Marxism, and we have a Marxist in the White House, and so they get these former state beauty queens and these sort of metrosexual-looking guys all dressed up and puffed up with perfume and makeup, and put them on TV, and it sounds all reasonable and calm and everything, but really they're radical leftists, and so it apparently works in duping a lot of the public into thinking that this harsh anti-American, foreign ideology of collectivism is somehow reasonable and productive.
Dr. DiLorenzo, I know you're an economist. What do you see looking forward here in the U.S. economy in the coming weeks, months, and perhaps even years?
Yeah, well, now that we've got a lame duck Marxist in the White House, we're going to see an explosion of government regulation, especially environmental regulation. We're going to see an explosion of regulations regarding the healthcare industries and an explosion of all kinds of taxes that are already written into law to finance socialized medicine, among other things. And then, of course, the powers that be in Washington are going to raise general taxes. They're debating this fiscal cliff nonsense is all a big charade. What needs to be done is something radical like the abolition of the income tax and the replacement of it with nothing in order to revive our economy. But they're all moving headlong in the opposite direction. So I've become totally pessimistic about this, and that even the Fed announced just yesterday that they see high unemployment lasting for at least another 3 years. And of course they do. We see nothing but an explosion of government. And every dollar the government spends, it has to come out of the private sector one way or another. So we're seeing an explosion in government and a continued shrinkage of job creation and entrepreneurship and private sector growth. And I don't see an end to it unless something really radical and drastic changes. Like I said, like the abolition of the income tax and a cutback of our military empire.
I'm a pretty big fan of Peter Schiff and been following him and his predictions. I know that you have mentioned him before in the past. Do you agree with him when he says that we're probably headed for a sovereign debt crisis sometime soon?
Well, no one knows what soon is the thing. And so, the politicians have made so many promises that they can never possibly hope to keep them. And the unfunded debt is probably $100 trillion or more, but no one can predict when there will be a crisis. And so I don't know if I can agree with Peter Schiff or not. I agree that we're destroying our currency, but the timing of it is something no one knows.
All right, Dr. DiLorenzo, thanks a lot for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care and have a good day.